over the review that really went by really quickly. So let me just keep reviewing the semester. I think last week or Monday, I basically stopped talking at I got cut off at the fourth week or third week, really, but talking about the exchange of money. So let me just go over supply and demand really quickly. So when we have supply, I'm going to evaluate the practice quiz. No, I'm not going to evaluate the practice quiz. Do people with SAS need to contact you again regarding the final? No. Can you review quiz question that a lot of us got wrong? I don't see statistics on individual questions because over the semester there have been 2,000 questions that you guys have answered. So if you have a specific question that you don't know about, I can answer that. Yes, so the additional time, if you had contacted me through SAS and told me that SAS has put you on the list of students who need extra time, I have to input that personally. So I've only had 2 students message me that they need SAS accommodation. I've had several other students talk to me at the beginning of the year saying that they need SAS accommodation, but they never followed up with me. And I actually tried reaching out to SAS and they would not tell me which students need accommodation. So it's all on you as the students. So if you need the extra accommodation, you got to message SAS, who then messages me with your requirements. And I have no problem giving you extra requirements. That's not an issue with me, but I just need to know. Yes, so there's only been 2 students. And that's... let me just check the chat. Yeah, it's only been 2 students. So if you have not been getting extra time on the quizzes, then you're not on my list of students who need extra time. So that's issue number 1. Is that clear? Okay, assuming that's clear. So let's move on now just to review supply. Supply was the direct, so we have price and we have quantity. Supply is the direct relationship between price and quantity. It's an upward sloping graph. Repeat what? Sorry. No, so there's not going to be any specific focus. It's just going to be drawn pretty evenly, honestly, from the semester. I mentioned in the beginning of the semester, it's going to be a totally comprehensive exam, and it's going to draw only from, so it's going to be half multiple choice, half long answer, and the multiple choice questions are just going to be the same questions that you've been looking at from the semester. I posted a practice exam. The practice exam is supposed to recreate the conditions for the multiple choice portion of the exam. And we also have the time limit. So I set, I think, a 60-minute time limit for the non-SAS students, which I think 60 minutes, I based that off the fact that 60 minutes, 38 questions, I think. And I based that off the fact that for a typical quiz, it takes 30 minutes for a student to answer. And these are questions you've seen before on concepts you're supposed to have been reviewing, and the fact that you are allowed to call up your other friends and have a group chat going to talk about questions and answers. So 60 minutes for 35 questions or 38 questions. I think that's going to be plenty of time. Um, the long answer questions are also going to be from a test bank. I'm going to be posting the test bank by the end of today for the long answer questions. Any other general questions about the final? Since we're allowed to chat and use other resources, there's no lockdown browser. That's correct. There is no lockdown browser. Um, there's no. I'll be. I'll also be on Twitch. Just hanging out on Twitch. If anybody has a question they want to ask me, if a question's unclear or something, um, I'll be hanging out on Twitch, and you can ask me questions at the same time. Will there be questions about specific readings? It's going to be the same uh, uh, questions from the quizzes, right? And the quizzes will ask about specific readings. So yeah. So but the long answer questions, no. The long answer questions are going to be very general. They're going to be very general. You'll see when I send the questionnaire, the question bank to you guys today, how general they will be, and it's going to be at least 50, maybe up to 100 questions that I'll be drawing from. And for the exam, I haven't decided yet on whether I'll be asking one or two long answer questions. But I really want you guys to talk to each other regarding these questions and get ideas and plan out answers, etc. What is it that can actually shift the supply and demand curves? Okay, great. Are the long answer questions pulling from the questions at the end of the textbook chapter? No, they're not. They're going to be original questions. I'm coming up with them. Again, I'll be posting all the long answer questions. You'll have a total list of all the long answer questions by the end of today. Joe Exotic, I will be getting to your question as soon as we clear up all other questions regarding the final. Any other questions? Will you be posting the review on YouTube? This review, if you guys want, sure. I posted the other review as well. I just didn't send an email about it because I was gonna make another announcement at the same time as the email. In effect, I'll give you guys the preview. I'm going to be making the final exam optional for only for those students who are going to be taking a pass-fail on the course. The online exam I'm making using the same software that I make the quizzes. In fact, it's going to you're going to be going into the quizzes section, and the final exam is going to be there, and you'll be taking it just like a normal quiz, except it's going to be longer and you only get one attempt to do it. The practice quiz, however, you have unlimited attempts to do it. What if we were using our final mark to determine whether or not we want to take a pass-fail? Unfortunately, the university regulation is that I have to know whether you're using the final exam opting out of the final exam before you take the final exam. So I was waiting for clarification on that, which came in last night, late last night. So I was going to send out an email today. You have to make the decision whether you're going to opt out of the exam before you write the exam. What if we are passing the class before the exam, but then we are failing after? That's going to be really unfortunate. Again, you can only choose to opt out of the exam before you write the exam. So the deadline I'll be posting tonight is going to be April 24th. You guys should be getting your hearing marks back by next week. So the TAs should be finishing by the 13th or 14th regarding the markings. They've got their own exams to go over and prep for. So by the end of next week for sure, you will all have your marks, and then at that time you can determine whether you can whether you're passing or failing the course. And at that time you can also choose to opt out of the exam or not. Yes, you can still take a pass after writing the final exam. You can even drop the course even after getting your final grade, right? So the final date to drop the class is going to be May 20th, I think, which is going to be way after you write the exam, which is also going to be after you get your final grades as well. So you can see your final grade and then choose to take a pass or fail on the exam, on the whole course, or you can even choose to drop the course altogether. But if you want to opt out of the exam, you have to tell me before the exam date. All right, so if there's no other questions regarding the final, let me just repeat again for Jesus Christ that you have to email SAS for SAS to then email me so that I can add the extra time to your exam. If I don't know the extra time, there's no way there's going to be extra time added automatically. I have to tell the software to add your extra time for you. Okay, so contact SAS and tell them to email me your special requirements, and I will make those adjustments myself. Okay, so let's get back to can we go over? Yes, so that's what we're gonna do. So let's start with supply. So supply is the direct relationship between price and quantity. Direct means as one goes up, the other goes up as well. Supply is how much producers are willing and able to sell at a certain price. Okay? So this is what you have to remember. Supply, willing, and able to sell. Willing and able. So two things. What shifts the supply is literally anything other than a change in price. Okay? Anything other than a change in price will cause a shift in the supply curve. So it's a change in preferences, change in risk, change in taste, change in the weather, change in anything in the world other than price will shift the supply curve. Okay? And it's the same for demand. So demand is a inverse relationship between price and quantity. As price goes as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So let me type in quantity supplied, quantity demanded. Okay? Quantity demanded is not the same thing as demand. Demand is the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Supply is the relationship between price and quantity supplied. You have to be really careful not to confuse quantity supplied and supply. It's the same thing as I don't know, the difference between Brangelina, I guess if you guys even know, a relationship between a component of that relationship. So Brangelina was Brad and Angelina. Brad is not Brangelina. Okay, so you got to be curious, or you got to be aware and paying attention to whether the question is talking about quantity supplied or supply. Supply is the willingness and ability to sell at a certain price, and it's a direct relationship. So, which means as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. And uh, if the willingness or the ability of the producers, of the suppliers changes, that's going to shift the demand or shift the supply curve one way or the other. Okay? And it's the same thing for demand. Demand is the whether someone is willing and able to buy. They have to be willing and able to buy. If you're just willing to buy but you're not able, that doesn't reflect in the demand curve. For example, I'm really willing to buy a Ferrari, but I'm not able to buy one because I don't have the money for it, right? So that's part of demand. Or I'm also really willing to go swimming in the Marianas Trench, which is the deepest point on the Earth's surface. It's under the ocean, but I'm not able to do that because I do not have access to the submarines and the special training required. So I don't have a demand for deep diving into the Marianas Trench. Okay. Again, what shifts the demand curve is anything that changes the willingness or the ability of people to buy. Okay, so that includes anything other than the price or the quantity demanded, which means if preferences change, if incomes change, if there's an earthquake, if anything, literally anything changes other than the given price, then we have a shift in the demand curve. Okay, and if the shift in the demand curve makes people more willing to buy something, then it shifts out. If it makes people, if there's a change that makes people more able to buy something, then it shifts out. If producers become more willing to supply something, the supply curve shifts out. And if they become more able to supply something, the supply curve shifts out. Any questions so far? Questions. Okay. So that was supply and demand. Let's see. So marginalism, okay? When it comes to marginalism, you have to understand that decisions are made at the margin. What does it mean at the margin? Remember when we were building up the supply and demand curves in class, I drew those dotted lines. Well, you have a ranking of your preferences. So we have your, we'll call this Steve's preferences. So number one is to eat a ham sandwich. Number two is to go outside. Number three is to call his girlfriend. Okay, so he's got three preferences. His marginal preference is the thing that he, so whatever you give up, so marginalism is about marginal benefit, and marginal cost. So the marginal benefit is the specific thing that you're getting out of an exchange, and the marginal cost is the specific thing that you're giving up. Marginal doesn't mean some unimportant small thing. It's just the marginal benefit is the last benefit you get on your preference scale. The marginal cost is the thing that you give up in order to get that marginal benefit. Okay? And because we have benefits and costs, we get to draw these curves all the time, right? So the reason we have these curves, this is benefits, and then this is going to be the total quantity. Benefits are increasing at a decreasing rate until there's some, until there's going to be some optimum. Can you even see this? There we go. Until you get to some optimum. So people are going to be making these trade-offs, and what's causing this curve to come down is the cost. Okay? So the benefits you are getting, there's a maximum benefit you can get, so that if you are consuming more of that good, it costs more for you to attain that good or consume that good than the benefits you get out of it. Okay. When the economy grows, okay, so I'll come back to Megan's question. So the question is, can we repeat each of those definitions? So marginal benefit is the last benefit, is the benefit that you get for the specific benefit that you get for taking on an exchange, and the marginal cost is the specific cost of taking part in an exchange. So here's an easier example. So you have $10, but you don't have a burger. And when I'm putting it in parentheses means that you don't have it. Okay, so this is you. And then you go to Burger King. They have a burger. They have a burger, but they don't have $10. They don't have $10. They do have a burger. So this is going to be your first preference. This is their second preference. For Burger King, $10 is their first preference. A burger is their second preference. When you exchange $10 for a burger, your marginal benefit is the burger. Your marginal cost is the $10. For Burger King, it's the other way around. Their marginal benefit is the $10. Their marginal cost is the burger. Okay? And it doesn't have to be money, of course. So if you're just doing barter, it's you. Your number one preference is a burger that you don't have. Your number two preference is filet o fish. And then you got McDonald's here. Their number one preference is a filet o fish. Whoops. They want a filet o fish, but they don't have, they don't have a filet o fish. They have a burger, but they would rather the filet o fish. So again, you make the trade. You give your filet o fish for their burger. Your marginal benefit was the burger. Your marginal cost was the filet o fish. Their marginal benefit was the filet o fish. Their marginal cost was the burger. Okay? Megan, I'll come back to your question hopefully soon. Let me just keep moving on with the chronology of this course. So we talked about regulatory takings a lot. That was the issue of what the government is allowed to take, when they're allowed to take it, and what they have to do to compensate you, which is they can take your property. They can take it if they think it's in the public benefit, it's in the public interest. The problem there is defining what the public interest is very vague and ambiguous and prone to abuse, and they have to pay you a fair market price. Okay, that's what happens with expropriation. We talked about the not so wild west. People have different property rights regimes in different contexts. When you have a lot of space and your food is roaming, you're not going to have very strict land property rights. But if you have crops and animals that you are domesticating and you need a specific plot of land, then you come up with very strong property rights that defend your land, your specific use of land. We also talked about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is fundamentally it's about predicting the future. Here we go. What is the ratio of questions? Okay. We'll come back to that question later. Let's just keep pushing through with the syllabus. Entrepreneurship is predicting the future. Okay? So entrepreneurship is dealing with the unknown. Dealing with the unknown. And when it comes to dealing with the unknown, you have to put up capital first. So that's why entrepreneurs risk their capital. They pay people, when they're using laborers, they're paying their laborers in advance before the goods that they're producing are available for sale. And they don't know whether they'll be able to sell properly. And the way they try to predict is that they predict what consumer demands. So there's a timeline here. So there's time. If this is T1, this is T2. So they're trying to predict consumer demand in T2, what it will be in T1. Okay? So they're trying to predict consumer demand, and then they produce today based on this information. And then they try to sell. They have their products, and then they try to sell to consumers, hopefully at that price. You can even think of it here as the price. And then consumer demand can be up or down for the price that they're willing to pay. And if the price that consumers are willing to pay is lower than the total price, than the total cost per production of their production process, then they make a loss. They make an entrepreneurial loss. They lose money, and they'll go out of business. And some entrepreneurs are better at predicting what this future demand will be. Some of them are just get lucky, And there's lots of stories of very, very smart entrepreneurial people, as well as lots of just lucky people. For example, there was a guy who bought a hotel, a rundown hotel in Los Angeles, and it was not very useful as a hotel, but he bought it and he painted the side, and he realized that the side of the hotel is facing a very busy highway. So he bought the hotel and he painted the side and sold advertising space on the side of his hotel that's facing this busy highway, and he was making more money based on the advertising than he was on people staying at the hotel. So that's a kind of entrepreneurship. Other kind of entrepreneurship is people who were just making masks normally 3 months ago, and then all of a sudden there's this huge demand for masks now globally. So they also are making lots of money. Oh, this was not visible. Okay. So, what's the ratio of the questions asked on the readings for conceptual questions based on? So, for the final exam, the questions are going to be drawn totally randomly from the question bank. Okay? And the question bank has some conceptual questions and it has questions based on the readings, and it's going to be random. That's if you've been finding a lot of conceptual questions, if you redo the practice, you'll get a different set of questions, right? And in fact, if anything, the conceptual questions should be coming up less often, because there's only about 200 or so of those conceptual questions, whereas as opposed to like 1,800 of the questions based from the textbook. Okay. So Megan asks, when the economy grows, the stages of production triangle grows with it. Does that mean that it takes longer for goods to get to market or less time? Okay. Does it mean there are more or less goods? So to answer that second question first, it means there are more goods. The bigger the triangle is, the more goods there are for sale. Let me draw this out. Okay, so actually I'm just going to redraw the whole cycle there. So let's start with the loanable funds market. Loanable funds. This has the interest rate, and this is both savings and investment. You have your supply of savings, and then you have your demand for savings, which people who are demanding savings are using the savings to invest. The equilibrium price in the loanable funds market, we call this the interest rate. We also have this PPF. The PPF, on this axis, it has consumption goods, and on this axis it has investment goods. Okay? This is investment goods, this is consumption goods. Wherever the investment quantity is in equilibrium in this market, you come up to the PPF, and that's how much investment goods they'll be producing on the PPF, and they'll be producing this much consumption goods at the same time. So investment is used to produce both consumption goods as well as investment goods, because even a restaurant that makes food right away, they still involve some investment as well to build up to build a building or rent a building and rent equipment, etc. Okay? From here, we've got this structure of production. It looks like a triangle. This is supposed to be the top of the triangle. Yeah. So this, the height of the triangle gives you how much consumer goods are being built at every stage. So there are several stages. I'm just making it up here. This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages. Okay? As the economy grows, the PPF grows, and the triangle grows. As the PPF grows, this wherever you are on the PPF goes out with it, and you end up with both more consumer goods and more investment goods. And when you get to this bigger triangle, again, this is supposed to be matching up to the top of the triangle, I'm sorry. When you get to this bigger triangle, you're getting more consumer goods. This is more consumer goods. And you're getting more stages of production. So you're going to get more stages of production. The more stages of production also means you're going further out into the production process, which means you are taking longer periods of time to make consumer goods. And it's a little confusing because at some level it becomes faster to make things, right? Because if you have more capital goods, for example, if you have more shovels, it becomes easier and faster to dig, okay? But you also take longer to produce shovels, which means you have to dig further down into the ground to make to mine out more metals and more wood, etc. So you take on longer production processes, but the reason you do this is because they have more output later. Can I make it possible to review previous quizzes? So in previous years that this class has been going on, the choice has been made not to have the ability to review quizzes, past quizzes. The reason was so that it encourages you guys to talk to each other and also ask questions of me, and that's I'm going to keep that tradition this year as well. So I'm still having these review sessions. If you have special questions, just ask them here. With increased economic growth, are we not moving towards increased efficiency from a production perspective? No. So the economy, you have to understand, efficiency just means making things better, and at any specific point in time, things in equilibrium. Things should be as good as they could be, or almost as good as they could be. When you're making more things, you could say that you're making things more efficient. So you could say that, but only if this growth is sustainable. Okay? So if you have this situation where if you have the supply of money increasing, which is going to decrease the interest rates. It decreases the interest rate, which has a dual effect of having lower interest rates for investors, which makes them want to invest more, right? They'll want to invest more, going back up to this original PPF. But savers, because they're getting less interest on their savings, they'll want to save less. And you can think of it this way. If you were getting, so right now most of us are getting almost 0% on our savings at the bank. And we're not saving much as a consequence. But if the bank started offering a 20% per year savings rate, how much money would you be saving regularly? You'd probably be saving a lot more, right? So, but if central banks cause interest rates to go down by printing more money, then the savings rate, or the interest rate will fall, and the savings rates will decrease. Savings rate decreases. What are you going to do with that extra money? You're going to consume in the present. And when you're consuming in the present more, that means you have less money to save for future production or future consumption. Meanwhile, producers are producing more with the expectation that they'll be able to sell at some future point in time to you. But some future point in time happens, the economy is trying to reach this point beyond the PPF, but they're trying to sell you things. Producers are trying to sell you things that you do not have the money to buy, and so the producers go bankrupt, and the supply chain goes bankrupt, and people lose jobs, lose incomes, etc. And we get into a recession, which means people fall back into they fall within the PPF. And when you're within the PPF, moving towards the PPF is making things more efficient. But when you are on the PPF curve, that means you are at maximum efficiency at that point in time. Okay? You are at maximum efficiency, even though you're working to make things better in the future. At that specific point in time when you're on the PPF, you are at maximum efficiency. Isn't increasing the money supply making things less efficient? Because we end up, so it will eventually make things less efficient when we have a recession. Also, it'll make things less efficient because we are overproducing. We are overproducing and overconsuming. Can you go over when there is more than 1 point on the PPF? Yes. So let me redraw this to make things clearer. So I'm just going to focus on this loanable funds market, interest rates, and then I'll just call this investments on this axis. We have the demand, and then we have the supply, and then here we have the PPF. This is consumption goods, this is investment goods. So at the initial equilibrium, we're producing this much investment goods and this much consumption goods. Okay? Now, this is the supply of savings, okay? Now, if the central bank increases the supply of loanable funds with an increase in the supply of money, this has two simultaneous effects. Well, it lowers the interest rate for sure, okay? They lower the interest rate by increasing the supply of money, and the first thing this does is that it allows investors to have more money to borrow to invest. Okay? Remember, investors are borrowing money. This is loanable funds, the market for loanable funds. So they are taking on loans. They're taking on more loans than the equilibrium in order to invest more, to make more investment goods. Okay? And consumers, they're expecting consumers to be consuming at this lower level. Okay? But by lowering the interest rate for loanable funds, the central bank is also creating a disincentive for saving. So savers are still on this original supply curve for their savings. And because they're saving less, they're using their extra money that they would have otherwise been saving in order to consume more in the present. So this is happening simultaneously. Simultaneously, investors are investing more, but consumers are consuming more. Consumers are using more of their money in the present to buy more frivolous things. They're eating out more, they're buying more toys. They're not saving for the future. Meanwhile, investors are producing with the expectation that consumers in the future will have more money to buy things with. So this is the problem, that they're trying to reach this point beyond the PPF. And so when we get to this future state, where investors are trying to sell goods at a price that consumers cannot afford, then their whole investment structure has to fall apart. They have to lay people off. They realize they've made mistakes. They lay people off. They order fewer goods and services. Their suppliers have to lay people off, etc. And it has those cascading effects that results in people going within the PPF afterwards. What is an example of S plus delta M in the economy? So whenever the central bank, you hear on the news that the central bank lowers the interest rate, right? Whenever they lower the interest rate, what that means is they're making it cheaper for their primary dealers to borrow. And the way the central bank works, how other banks borrow from the central bank is printing the money out of thin air. They're printing the money brand new. There's not any other money in the economy. They have an account that says Scotiabank on it, and then the Scotiabank has already $1 billion in their accounts, and then they say, okay, you want more money? You will now have $2 billion in your account, and that's it. It's literally that easy. They're just printing the money. And printing money, let me be clear. Printing money is a metaphor, because central banks don't print money anymore. Everything is digital. So they just add just another zero to your account at the central bank. So let's actually just review how central banks work. So you have the central bank, CB. So in Canada, it's the Bank of Canada. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve. In most countries in the world, it's the Bank of whatever country, Bank of England, Bank of Japan. Only in the United States, they call their central bank the Federal Reserve. So you have the central bank, and the central bank, you can think of it as a bank to other banks. But it's not all other banks. It's a special number of banks, which they call the primary dealers. Call them PD. So PD1, PD2, PD3. It's in the U.S. It's about I think about 17 or 20 primary dealers that have accounts at the central bank, and the central bank offers a lot of services. But one of the services it offers is that it loans money to these other banks on a short-term basis. And how it facilitates these loans is that it doesn't just give you the money. It's because it's a loan. You still need to put up some collateral, and well, they do their loans, and they also do asset purchases. So they make money in two ways. So the loans is that this guy he needs a loan, and so other banks won't give him a loan. So he goes to the central bank at a slightly higher interest rate. He gets a loan from the central bank, and the central bank will just add some zeros to their account. So if this guy has initially his account was $1 billion, this guy will say, okay, in time one, after his loan, this guy will say, okay, you now have $1.1 billion at time two. That's it. That's how it works. That's a $100 million loan instantly. Okay? Another way that central banks create money is that they do asset purchases, and the assets that they buy are either stocks or treasuries, bonds, government bonds. And how that works, they don't go, if they want a government bond, for example, they don't go to the government directly. So you have the government here. They sell bonds. You have this primary dealer paying some money to the government in order to get some bonds. And then the primary dealer or the central bank will pay more money to the primary dealer in order to buy that same bond. So they'll pay, for example, twice as much money. Won't be twice as much, but I'm just using $2 signs to indicate that it's more money than what the primary dealer paid to the government in order for the primary dealer to then sell the bond back to the central bank. So that's another way. So it doesn't have to be a bond, it's stocks as well. Wouldn't printing money increase the inflation rate by a lot? Well, it'll definitely increase inflation, but by what percentage is going to be determined by how much printing there is relative to the total money stock in the economy. So it's 2:23 right now. I can go for another 10 minutes if you guys are willing. Yes? I can do it. Okay. So let's do it. What other questions you guys got for me? Okay, while you guys are thinking up of questions, let me just talk a little bit more about economic growth. So let me pull something up. If it will load. Okay. So you've seen the exponential charts of the COVID-19 growth, right? So here is a chart for GDP per capita in England. So what is GDP per capita? And we talked about how GDP was a measure of national income. Okay, so income from, or how they measure national income, quote unquote, is expenditures on consumption, on investments, on government expenditures, as well as net exports. So let me just write that down again. So GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX. So consumption plus investments plus governments plus net exports. And net exports means exports minus imports. Okay? So you have net exports, and all these things represent GDP, and GDP is like the income of a country or whatever unit, economic unit that you want to think of. It's the income of that economic unit per some period of time, per quarter, per year, per decade, whatever. And we talked about how it's an imperfect measure. The history is very politicized, etc. But it's still, you can still get some information from it. If it like crashes to zero, if it was going up all the time and then suddenly it crashes down, you know something's wrong. Okay? So I mentioned that it was a flow in the original lecture. And the reason is, when I say flow, that means it's per unit of time, right? So GDP is some income per unit of time. GDP is income per time period. And you have to be careful when comparing GDP to other things that aren't flows like this as well. So one thing that people talk about compared to is GDP and government debt, right? So debt is the total amount owing, how much you owe at a specific period of time. At a specific period of time. Okay? If you're comparing, you have to be really careful to compare things at a specific period of time versus things that happen over a period of time. This is like comparing a picture versus a movie, or a statue versus a movie. And you have to be careful that your units match. Okay? So that's the first thing you should be aware of when it comes to GDP and other things, is that it's a flow, right? Flow, because it's moving over time. And things like debt are, we call them stocks, because it's like beans or whatever commodity. It's just sitting there. Okay, so that's just one thing to review over for what GDP is. It's a flow over a period of time. And I guess before I move on, let me just check with the chat. What is the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP? Which is more used and why? Okay, so nominal GDP is just all these numbers measured in the current dollars, whatever the dollars that are currently spent. Real GDP is trying to calculate what that number should be if we take account inflation. That's the difference between nominal and real. Real is supposed to be taking inflation into account. Okay? Nominal is not the same thing as per person. When we say per person, we mean per capita. And talking about GDP per capita, here is this GDP per capita graph of England. It goes from the year 1270. So there's a whole field of economics called economic history, where they try to estimate GDP and other sorts of measures in the past. And they are measuring GDP per capita in the year 1270, about 800 years ago. And it was, well, we can kind of guess, it was about $100 per year. That's less than $1 per day. And it stayed virtually constant until about the mid-1600s, when it started growing a little bit, until about the mid-1700s, when it started growing a lot. And then by the mid-1800s, it started going gangbusters. And then by the mid-1900s, it started getting vertical, right? And this little blip here in the mid-1900s, that was World War I. This second blip here, that was the Depression and World War II. So income per person, and this is always going to be measured in real GDP and not nominal GDP. So this is accounting for inflation. People in 1270 were just as poor as people were in about 1600, and which means most people were very poor. Most people were living hand to mouth. Most people were basically doing sustenance farming or subsistence farming. But we can do better than this. here is the share of the world population living in absolute poverty. Absolute poverty means the GDP per capita or the income per capita adjusting for inflation is less than a couple bucks a day, and they've got different measures here. So we have this red line is living less than $1 a day, this yellow line as living less than $2 a day, and this black line here as living less than $1.90 a day. And if before I should have asked you guys, most people probably think that the level of poverty in the world has increased over the last 20 years. When you look at it, it's gotten so much better. We've gotten so many millions, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last few decades, and it's a miracle that we're not celebrating enough. So this is just people living in absolute poverty around the world. We've got some other graphs here. So this is the total world population is this total line, and then the green portion of this graph is the people who are not in extreme poverty, and the people who are in this red portion are in extreme poverty. And if you go back to 1820, almost everyone was living in extreme poverty. And as we kept going, as population got increased, as we went from about 1 billion in population to over 7 billion, we have more people living today outside of extreme poverty than any other time in history. And we have more people just living really, really nice lives in general. Let me get one more graph in here. Yeah, so here are some poverty graphs for rich countries. USA is this blue line. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand are combined in this yellow line. Italy is this green line. Japan is this red line. And then the rest of the world is this blue line. And you can see some countries got richer, especially since the 1850s. So the US was already very rich compared to the rest of the world, even as far back as the early 1800s. And the rest of the world caught up to the US. Australia, New Zealand, Canada caught up really, really quickly. And Italy and Japan also caught up quickly. You have to also be careful how people measure poverty is different country to country. So they are using, for example, a lot of countries, they measure poverty by relative poverty. So they say there's always going to be a bottom 10%. And that's mathematically true. But the bottom 10% in the United States are still much richer than the bottom 70% in a poor country like Zambia, right? So the bottom 10% in the United States, they have access to high-speed internet. The bottom 10% of the United States, they have access to a lot more calories per meal than most other people in the world. So being poor in the United States isn't nice, but it's nicer than being poor in a lot of other countries. So something else to think about. Any questions on that or anything else? All right. If that's it, then just going to give one last second for anyone. All right. Oh, tips on being an entrepreneur. Predict the future better than everyone else, and make sure that you buy low and sell high. Maybe not in that order. Also, don't think that you have to reinvent the wheel in order to be an entrepreneur, right? Steve Jobs didn't invent the PC. Steve Jobs didn't invent the MP3 player. Microsoft didn't invent the the operating system, right? You don't have to be the first. You don't have to be an inventor in order to be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneur, you got to take risks, and you got to just see the future better than everyone else. Any other questions? All right, guys. See you on Friday.